Good afternoon. I'm Charles Liddell, Senior Advisor and Australia Chair here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We're here today to discuss the launch of a new CSIS report by the Defence Industrial Initiatives Group and the Australia Chair, sponsored by the Australian Department of Defence and entitled Enhancing Defence Industrial Cooperation Between Australia and the United States. This report is a culmination of a years-long project to examine the drivers behind Australia and U.S. industrial-based cooperation, the opportunities and challenges facing each country, and potential paths forward to improve cooperation in this critical area. Now, this report comes in at a critical time, as the U.S. and Australia navigate the future of the alliance under the new Trump administration and in the context of rising global and indeed regional tensions. As these longtime allies look to strengthen their security and economic relations, an essential element to consider is further enhancing and integrating their defense and industrial bases. In fact, both the U.S. and Australia have made significant strides to strengthen their industrial bases and promote defense industrial integration. The U.S. Department of Defense released its National Defense Industrial Strategy in 2024, and Australia also published its Defense Industry Development Strategy. Both documents emphasize the importance of robust defense industrial bases. And yet, U.S. and Australian companies still face significant barriers to deeper cooperation. To better understand how to overcome these barriers and facilitate increased cooperation, the CSIS team conducted extensive research, interviews with private industry and government officials in both countries, as well as conferences, workshops, and a Track 1.5 dialogue with key stakeholders. The resulting report details the findings from these activities, including the different types of barriers that exist, the ways in which these barriers affect various paths of cooperation, and lastly, how both governments might work to overcome these obstacles. One thing is clear: breaking down these barriers will take concerted efforts by governments and industry from both countries. Now, to help me dive into the findings of this report and its implications for the U.S.-Australia defense industrial relationship, I'm very excited to be joined by Cynthia Cook, Director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group and Senior Fellow with the Defense and Security Department here at CSIS, as well as my partner in crime on this project, as well as Dak Hardwick, Vice President of the International Affairs at the Aerospace Industries Association, and Lee Goddard, Executive Director of the Australian Missile Corporation. Folks, this is an all-star lineup that we have. Just to give you a sense of who we've got in the room here, Dr. Cook serves as the director of the DIG program here. She's widely published on defense acquisition policy and organization, the defense industrial base, new technology development, and weapon system production and sustainment. She's a member of the editorial board for the Defense Acquisition Research Journal and is an adjunct professor at the Rand Graduate School. Lee Goddard, who's waking up early but not too early in Sydney, Australia, is the executive director of the Australian Missile Corporation. He has significant leadership experiences as board director, as CEO, in military command, as well as in senior policy and complex management roles across private and philanthropic sectors, national security domains, and a range of government agencies. In 2021, he led a Security of Defense review and contributed to the 2022 Australian Defence Strategic Review. He continues to serve as a Royal Australian Navy Active Reserve officer following 34 years of full-time service. Last but not least, of course, Dak is Vice President of International Affairs at AIA. In this role, he oversees AIA's international policy and advocacy program. As he was just telling us, that includes tariff policy as well, so he's a busy man. He also works on other areas such as defense and commercial trade, industrial cooperation, technological security, and global supply chains to stakeholders worldwide. He's previously worked at the Harris Corporation, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and held many other positions. We're thrilled to have everyone here today. All right, let's jump right into it. Cynthia, why don't you start us off by maybe giving us a bit more on the project, about both the why this particular topic is so important and so timely right now, as well as, because we want to probe the report a little bit more, the methodology that we use to set this up.
Well, first of all, I would encourage everybody to read the report, which covers everything in great detail. But I'll start off by talking a little bit about the why, the strategic challenge. The United States and Australia have shared a long history of cooperation, which has moved along at a steady state. But given, as you pointed out, recent changes in the strategic environment, including China's increase in aggressive activities, economic coercion, gray zone tactics in the Indo-Pacific region, and military expansion, as well as investments in their own industrial base, the strategic environment demands stronger ties between the United States and Australia. An integrated defense industrial base between the new nations is not just beneficial for the businesses in both nations for innovation, but really important for maintaining stability in the region and achieving the strategic goals of mutual interest. Really, production is deterrence, and that's what underpins this. Our relationship with Australia has been strong. They've mostly purchased arms from us, including fighter aircraft like the F-35A and the F-18A, as well as the Wedgetail Airborne Early Warning and Control aircraft and the P-8. Australia has also exported some weapons to the United States, including the Expeditionary Fast Transport. So this relationship underpins what we're talking about today. Operating the same equipment, it does allow the nations to fight together, and buying from each other can enhance individual nations' industrial base. But that is not the only kind of tie that truly strengthens cooperations between two partners. For that, we need to work together at the front end and throughout the programs. We need to design, develop, produce, operate, and maintain programs together. We need to engage each other's supply chains, both for innovation, but also to be able to surge and fix challenges should we need to. For example, in the United States, the solid rocket motor industrial base is quite constrained, and that's something that Australia is working on in its guided weapons and explosive ordnance program. So we can build on each other's capabilities, and we do need to work together. So there is a strategic imperative here. Yeah. However, there are also some challenges. If it was easy, we would have a lot more of it. There are the traditional challenges that are highlighted, like considerations with ITAR, which is export control regime that is designed to make sure that our capabilities don't fall into the hands of adversaries. There's also cultural challenges and a range of their challenges as well. The issue is really a broader ecosystem one, and it needs an ecosystem approach to fix. And that's one of the things we'll talk about in the conversation today. There's also not just one way of doing business. If we could put up the wiring diagram, we can see that when we're looking at the industrial base, there's the notion that we're integrated, but that's really at an actor-to-actor level. We need business-to-business relationships. We need government-to-business relationships, and we need government-to-government relationships. So this map lays that out and talks about where we can integrate, where it's easy, and where it's more difficult. And just to cut to the chase, the biggest challenge that we unpacked was the difficulty of small and medium-sized innovative Australian firms to become part of the U.S. industrial base, to find a place on our weapons, to help us with surge capacity, and to bring their innovation. So that's one of the challenges that we found today. There is bureaucratic complexity, there's cultural differences in business approaches, there's lack of clarity in messaging, and all of these issues intertwine to create an environment where it is difficult to work together. That said, there is really a tremendous amount of interest in better integration, both on the Australian side and on the US side. And there's some great efforts underway. Austrade here at the embassy works to bring Australian firms over to meet potential sponsors. Australia has invested in something called the Global Supply Chain, where they work with prime contractors across the world to try to share more about Australia's capabilities. So there are efforts underway, and what Australia and the US really need to do is recognize the importance of this relationship, both invest in overcoming these systemic barriers, and then track progress over time so that they can see how it's working.
Actually, can I actually just go back a second, because not everyone who's tuning in has yet read the full report. I fully echo my colleagues' comments. Download it, read it, hand it to your friends. But we detailed a little bit at the top about how we went about this. Can you talk about the methodology actually a little bit for how we came up with these conclusions? Like, for instance, the hardest pathway is figuring out how do you get small and medium Australian firms working with the U.S. government. But what was the method behind the report, Cynthia?
So thanks, Charlie. That is a great question. So our group, and of course others across CSIS, do a fair amount of research on cooperation with our allies and partners, and in particular, the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group looks at defense industrial cooperation. So we came into this project with grounding on what the issues and challenges are. We certainly did a literature review on what the specific challenges with Australia are, and then we went out and talked to people. We talked to government officials in both nations, and we also talked to small and medium-sized Australian industries and to U.S. industries that do business in Australia. To find the small and medium-sized industries, we did two things. First, we worked with Austrade. With Austrade, we found companies that were really interested in working in the U.S. They were ones that the Australian government had identified as companies with great technology that they wanted to encourage. We also worked with another consultant to find companies that were not involved with Austrade, with the idea that we wanted to make sure we were capturing both companies that were interested and had done it successfully, companies that were interested and were still trying, and then companies that just said, no, it's too much effort. So we talked to companies in all three groups. And we just heard so many interesting anecdotes, individuals that had clearances to work in the U.S. because of being in the military, but they couldn't see any of that same information as part of their industry experience. Another company talked about the difficulty of meeting with the sponsors. It was very funny because half an hour after I got off the phone with her, I got a notification about an industry event that one of the services was sponsoring that her work was exactly perfect for. So I sent it to her. She tried to register, and then it was U.S. persons only, U.S. companies only. So there are barriers. We called the organization putting on that conference. We tried to find out why it was U.S. only. We called multiple times, and they never got back to us. So these are these just persistent sand in the wheel that creates challenges. That means that Australian firms aren't able to sell as effectively in the U.S., but it also means that the U.S. military may not be getting the best of global technology that it could be.
Gotcha, thanks. Let me turn to Lee for a second. We're going to zoom across the Pacific and lots of questions for you, Lee. But I'd love to start out with kind of a couple of things. Give us a level set on why this issue set has become so important to Australia in the first place from the government. And then I'm asking you lots of questions because you wear more than one hat, Lee. How is that filtered into a demand signal for Australian companies, and how are they receiving that? I'd love to hear kind of the government settings and then the filter process down to Australian companies.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Cynthia, and congratulations on a very timely and impactful report. And Dak, great to be with you again. It is timely. When you think overnight in Australia, we've just had Elbridge Colby tell Australia basically he thinks we need to be at 3% in terms of defence spending, and I think that's a great wake-up call for the expectation. We've just had, of course, a PLA Navy task group. Continues to circumnavigate Australia, and there's obviously questions, commentary on our annual budget of $56 billion potentially increasing, and what we're actually getting for that. What's our defence industrial base actually producing in terms of contribution? And of course, there's a couple of other important words that are now being used probably more openly, apart from our defence industrial ecosystem and the fact that the defence relationship at the military level and the political level is very strong. There is a sense that our defence industrial based relationship needs to be stronger. And that word, as I said, mobilisation, small m, is now being used in terms of resilience and preparation. And of course, those other wake-up calls, Ukraine, Taiwan, Western Philippine Sea, Southwest Pacific, Antarctica, and grey zone activities in our northern approaches means that Australia has realised that we actually need mass, we need distribution, and we need high-end warfighting capability now. It has to be affordable, absolutely, but it has to be sustainable, has to be available, and it has to be the best in the world. I mean, AUKUS Pillar 2, if we're not getting the same systems as the US and UK at the same time, as a result of those projects, then we've actually failed. So that's an actual realisation here in Australia. The Defence Strategic Review, IIP, our Integrated Investment Program, and National Defence Strategy, is a disciplined process, but it can't be set and forget. So that's really important in terms of the timely reminder that it's not just 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. It's what we're doing right now. A couple of things just to remind ourselves with Australia. We actually are the fourth biggest importer of defence equipment by value in the world, 13th biggest economy. And we've actually got the fourth biggest, as Kevin Rudd last week, with all the superannuation funds hosting them, reminded us, the fourth biggest pool of private capital. So we've got lots of potential. And Australian industry, as Cynthia just highlighted, is ready and active. And part of the things that I've been focused on over the last 2 or 3 years is the exploration of not just our traditional defence industry base, Australia, and also the primes, not least the American primes in Australia, but also our emerging defence industry, our invention innovation industries, our research and development industries, our dual-use technologies, and our adjacent industries, and those that have actually adapted from, say, the automobile industry into the defence industry. And as Cynthia highlighted, it is ripe and they are ready. And it's also pleasing to see, in particular, the US primes, but more generally, foreign countries doing more in Australia. When we talk about sovereignty, it's not just about Australian companies, it's about control. It's about actually doing things in Australia because it's very important for Australia's security. I've also been involved in a couple of other companies which are now embedded in the United States system, for example, Austal or the Whiskey Project Group. And it's been very pleasing to see them buying into the US industrial base and having a great success. Just with the report, congratulations. I think it is all about barriers, those passive barriers, the regulatory, the rules, the policies, the security clearances. We have made significant progress. It'll be a use it or lose it if we don't do something with it now. Of course, there's those active barriers, our industrial systems, our standards, which we're working through. And one area I think we should really focus on is those cultural barriers, often the barriers that don't exist. Canberra, and I was Canberra, and I don't commentate or criticise because I was part of the system that has got us where we are now, does have fear of risk and change and technology, of probity, of failure. So we actually need to understand that and how we actually shift the dials and move much more quickly. So I'll just summarise there to say that the report has indicated the potential of our defence industrial ecosystem cooperation. The demand is there. As I said, overnight, we've had a significant US leader who'll probably be the Undersecretary tell us we need to get to 3%, and that's been received well. And we've also had a PLA Navy task group circumnavigate Australia. So we have plenty of wake-up calls, and it's now time to not admire the problem, but to get cracking on.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Really appreciate that. Can I get, not with your particular company 1, company 2, or company 3 hat, you have a lot of companies that you're involved with, but kind of zooming out from an Australian industry perspective, look, there has been movement over the last year and rather significant movement within the US legislative and regulatory process. What are you hearing, yes, in Canberra, but in Sydney, in Melbourne, Perth, what's been initial reaction by Australian firms to this? Do they see this as more favorable of an environment? Are there still too many questions to begin launching efforts? I like your phrasing of this is now a use it or lose it moment. So how are folks beginning to respond to this new environment we've shifted into?
I think overall positively, not with skepticism, or we've heard this all before. It feels and it is different. And we have license now to explore doing things in a different way. whether that be with our traditional company bases in Australia or with some of the disruptive companies which are now entering the Australian market. And also the potential of not just doing things in Australia for Australia and under the NTIB, also for our primary alliance partner, US or others, but potentially also doing things in Australia to export for to support some of the concerns we have in the region to ensure partners have some of the things that they need as well. So I think the sense is positive rather than skeptical. But of course, 2 or 3 months down the track, we'll see. I still get a sense that we have a system, just like in the US, which is overwhelmed at the moment for all the right reasons, because the demand signals are high, and we've got policies and processes and priorities in place, and anything new may be challenging at this particular time. So I think we just need to be very conscious of that and aware. As I say, overwhelmed, because I've been there as well, versus understanding about what we can do right now.
That's great. Thanks, Lee. Let me switch the lens a little bit. I mean, we've got an Australian take and an Australian perspective. Again, you're not representing any particular company.
That's right.
But a lot of companies kind of aggregated it all together.
That's right.
And first question, kind of big picture. What has been, the vibe from American companies about the prospect of working more closely with Australian counterparts, be they subsidiaries of American firms or small and medium enterprises?
So you're right to note that from the AIA perspective, even though aerospace is in our name, we actually represent companies that are we say, if it flies, floats, or rolls, generally we're going to represent it, right? And so we represent the entirety of.
What about if it hovers in outer space? Does that count?
So our space division would appreciate your endorsement there. But just to get to your question directly, it's something that I wrote down as you were doing your initial discussion. The energy behind the U.S.-Australia relationship is unlike anything that I have ever seen. There is so much energy in the U.S. defense industrial base, in the U.S. industrial base overall, to have a partnership with Australia for a variety of different reasons, whether it's because of a common threat, because of tremendous export opportunities, because of potential supply chain resilience that we see with Australian firms that are in Australia, for capabilities that don't necessarily exist in the region, but we would like to see from an industrial perspective in the region. The energy is just tremendous, and there really is no place to go but up. With the relationship, the U.S. and Australia, from an industrial perspective, have been partners for so many years, but for some reason, for a lot of reasons that we already know, it's been turned up to 11, and there is a willingness on both the Australian side and the U.S. industry side to meet in the middle, to be aggressive about getting after those barriers that you talked about, but frankly, do it in a timely manner because the threat is here. It's not 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. The threat is here. Let's identify what those barriers are. Let's get after them very, very quickly. And over the last 2.5 years, we've made tremendous progress. And I can't speak more to how the Australian government, the Australian people have really approached the U.S.-Australia relationship here in Washington. The three of us know that there's not much consensus in Washington these days. But when you think about the U.S.-Australia relationship, there is deep consensus, both on a bipartisan basis and on a bicameral basis. And that goes a long way with the U.S.-Australia industrial relationship, which really is the backstop to the government-to-government relationship.
Yeah.
A couple of things I think are important to point out. If the goal for the U.S. industry is to have a closer relationship with Australia, then it's a seamless ecosystem. Right? Really, that's what we're looking for. The regulatory barriers are eliminated, but we also get to some of the real tactical things that give us challenges give us challenges overall. Security clearance recognition, right? Certification of a workforce that does the same thing regardless of whether they're in the United States or whether they're in Australia. Even something that is as tactical as a facilities clearance, that a facility can be seen the same way in a classified setting in the U.S. as it is in Australia. So those are very tactical things, but those are barriers that we have to get over. And again, with the energy that we see in the relationship, we're moving in the right direction. I will say this, Cynthia talked about production is deterrence. I completely agree with her. But one of the things that I have seen that has been absolutely a game changer in the U.S.-Australia relationship, and frankly more than any other country in the world, is the influx of private capital. in the desire for private capital to be part of an industrial base for the purposes of growth, for the purposes of creating a dual use technologies. And I like to take the production as deterrence comment, and I like to say that capital is deterrence, because you can't have production without capital. And in a time when budgets are questionable, budgets may or may not go down, having that private capital invested in the industrial base from an enduring perspective is critical for the long-term investment, both for Australian firms and for U.S. firms.
Yeah, thanks, Dak. I like these concepts about, Lee said, mass is what we're looking for in Australia. Cynthia said, and you echoed, production is deterrence, because we're simply playing a numbers game here, and that capital is obviously the undergirding force behind that. Look, we're at a propitious moment for this to be released. Lee, you talked about testimony from several who have been in there, but I guess one of the things I'm thinking is we're at a propitious moment because everyone is highlighting with the new U.S. administration the need for this. This is bilateral. We're not talking about AUKUS, but we have heard in the context of AUKUS that AUKUS is the blueprint for how we want to do deep industrial collaboration. So I guess this is my long wind-up to asking you, which are the things, we see the demand signal, we see the need, people are interested, there's an energy, but we've got barriers. So what is the kind of priority order of what we're going after if you were to recommend it for the new team here about what they should be going for and after?
So we made tremendous progress over the last 18 months on the regulations related to international traffic in arms regulation. We think we need a fresh look at that because we've made tremendous progress. There's more to be done, whether it's on the excluded technologies list, whether it's on the regulation related to the missile technology control regime, anything related to the export control barriers that we still see. We think that there's an opportunity there. But I want to take your question and just move it up to a political level very quickly and just point something out. Secretary Hegseth's first meeting with a counterpart was with Deputy Prime Minister Marles. And that happened about a week after he was sworn in as Secretary of Defense. That is a tremendous signal to be sent, not only here in the United States, but also to Australia. And if you go back and you look at Secretary Hegseth's comments, they were absolutely in line with the long-standing, enduring relationship that the United States has with Australia. That is a huge demand signal that was sent to U.S. industry that the commitment is still there in Australia. We are full steam ahead in wanting to work with Australia. We cannot let it go by and not acknowledge that.
Yeah. Look, we're going to play a lot with this about kind of priority lists that get put in front of the administration. But again, you zoomed up to the political level. I'm going to zoom either up or down depending on how you take it to the strategic level. Lee was talking about this, about both Australia and the U.S. look at a similar suite of threats and challenges. It generally rhymes with China in one form or another. But I guess because it's not one nation, Lee was talking about sovereign capabilities, but two nations that have aligned but not identical interests here. I'd be interested to hear from everyone, again, this is more the demand signal side, about deeper industrial integration is not simply meant to kind of do more of what we've done before. It's not simply a hymn to the alliance's storied history, and it's not simply something you can put on a plate for leaders that look good. It's something that needs to be kind of deeply woven into the interests of both countries. The cold-headed, realistic calculation of national interest. Lee, let me throw to you actually first. Can you just kind of put this on a tee for us about what is it that deeper industrial integration gets Australia? This might seem obvious, but I think it's an important starting point in the conversation before we flip it to the U.S. side.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Well, look, I think the word sovereignty is important, but I think control, and from an Australian perspective, is more important. We have control from a self-reliant perspective of the things that we need. And to be frank, of course, while the US is our most important alliance military partner and our greatest defence industrial partner, we actually are wider. We have European defence industrial partners, etc. as well. So we actually have to be very broad in Australia to make sure that our needs are actually met, of course, within, in some ways being self-reliant within a very strong alliance system. I think that's really important as we explore all options. And I just want to really highlight as well, just one thing you brought up earlier as well. We'll do that not only with working very closely with the US Defence Industrial Base, but also getting our own industrialists within Australia into the system, because they see not only opportunities in actually assisting Australia and commercial outcomes as well, but also access into the US Defence Industrial Base as well. And I think that's a really important activity that is now driving our outcomes. So just want to repeat that though, it is about sovereignty, absolutely, in terms of sovereign Australian decisions. But for Australia, in terms of control, is making sure we do have supply. We do have infrastructure. We don't have just-in-time thinking. And those consumables of conflict, such as fuel and munitions, that we actually are ready at the level that we need to be. We are catching up to a certain extent. That's acknowledged. But the best time to start was 10 years ago. The next best time to start is today. And you can see that we clearly are starting in many areas.
No, I take your point here. So from an Australian perspective, clearly the growth of sovereign capabilities, which we can deem and hedge and describe in a lot of different ways, and then the arrival of kit, the acquisition, particularly in advanced firepower. And as Lee said, access to cutting edge technologies. I think that sounds similar, but I'm not sure if that sounds similar. Cynthia, let me throw to you. We keep talking about deeper integration, but what is it the U.S. is actually looking to get from deeper integration?
That's a great question, Charlie. Before I answer that, I'd like to add one last thing to what Lee said, which is that traditionally Australian demand has been relatively low compared to U.S. demand. So I've talked to companies that said, they get the requirement, they get the contract, they open a facility, they produce to the requirement, and then they have to close the facility because the Australian government's demand has been met. Working with U.S. industry or selling to the United States will uplift their industry to have them be able to maintain and sustain production over the longer run. And that's important for Australia, but it's also important for the United States, because if we are fighting in the Indo-Pacific, we are going to really need a local industrial base that we can draw from. Just the tyranny of distance and concern about contested logistics mean it's going to be a lot harder to get anything to the front. That includes military equipment, that includes consumables like munitions, and that also includes the capability to maintain aircraft, ships, etc. We're going to need to use our partners there for maintenance, repair, and overhaul. And these considerations are definitely reflected in U.S. government policy right now. The Partnership for Indo-Pacific Industrial Resilience, or PIPER initiative, and the Regional Sustainment Framework are both focused on addressing this challenge. I'd also like to highlight something that it occurs to me to mention about the National Defence Industrial Strategy and also Australia's DIDS. The NDIS is one of several reports that looks at U.S. supply chain challenges. And I just want to highlight that in the first Trump administration in 2018, there was another report on the industrial base that highlighted these challenges. So these issues are apolitical, they cross administrations, and we can all be hopeful that this next Trump administration looks back to the concerns they had 4 years ago and continues an emphasis on that. In terms of what the United States gets out of it,
you've already given us a list of about 3 or 4 different things, but keep going.
I just want to foot stomp the last thing, which is you work together, that enhances your partnership.
Dak, what else do you see kind of on top of that from a U.S. perspective?
So the biggest issue for U.S. industry is, again, regulatory harmonization, right? Because the more barriers you break down in law, policy, or regulation, the more likely it is that the U.S. industry will see it as a market that they're going to want to come into, right? And if you eliminate those barriers, it's a little bit like water. Like, capital will flow where you will have the least amount of resistance. And the more that we can integrate the regulatory system, the legal system, then you're going to see much more interest in the U.S. Wanting to invest in Australia. But I think there's something else here to talk about, and is that we have all been through supply chain challenges in the industrial base over the last 5 or 6 years. One of the things that we see is an Australian industrial base, while still relatively small, has world-class capabilities to come into the U.S. industrial base and provide supply chain resiliency in a way that if something bad happened on the U.S. side, then an Australian partner could then step up and then not have to go through a significant certification process to be able to pull in and make sure that the things that we are producing here in the United States can continue to be produced from a resiliency perspective. It's one of the reasons why there's so much energy, because it's manufacturing is, especially for aerospace and defense, is a unique capability for a nation. It's an expensive capability to develop. It takes years to be able to get there, and there are only a few countries in the world that can provide the type of manufacturing capability that is required for significant military systems. Australia is one of them, but we just want to supercharge that to be able to bring them into the industrial base even more for supply chain resiliency and to be able to help U.S. systems.
Yeah, Cynthia.
I just wanted to finger what Dak just said. So obviously you represent an industry association. That also aligns with my research. So in this case, this is what you're saying also connects to everything we've worked on. So this is not, I mean, this is an industry perspective, but it is also a research-focused perspective, that these are the interests and the barriers. I would add to the concerns about things like ITAR. Those are processes that are laid down and understood, and there's a process to work through them. Companies on both sides also face challenges with documents marked controlled unclassified information. You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
So concerns about there being documents that would be interesting to Australian industry that they just can't see and that they don't know about was a pretty pervasive concern in our interviews as well. So it's not just ITAR, which represents the information they know, it's the other information that they don't know. And ITAR also is a regulatory issue. It's also a cultural issue.
It is.
It quiets conversations. It makes people more cautious about sharing things. We had one company tell us that they were concerned about talking to foreign nationals for things that appeared on their website. It just was like, it's just a very sort of quieting. It limits the interactions that would underpin stronger defense industrial cooperation.
Yeah, let me just agree with Cynthia and just say this. The ITAR-related issues feel tactical in their nature, but they have strategic implications because they tend to slow down the cooperation. The purpose of the U.S.-Australia relationship is to not slow down, it's to speed up. And frankly, through a lot of good work that's been done both here in the United States and in Australia is where we've been able to get to this point. This is an important point to not let this go by, is that we have to give huge credit to the Australians because they did a significant overhaul of their entire export control system to be able to align with the U.S. for the purposes of accelerating capability delivery. And that was a significant technical requirement. It was a significant political move. But they made that choice to be able to better align with the United States, and it's starting to pay off already in U.S. and Australia capabilities.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you've thrown that out too, because now if we kind of got the Australian perspective of what it is that they're seeking, what it is that they get, this is a really important point, right? That for the U.S., we're seeking resilience in our supply chain, and Australia is a key input into that. We're seeking backstopping, and as Lee said, but it's true for the U.S. too, the ability to have pre-positioning of munitions, no less fuel, and other things in the region. And because of the closeness of the relationship, we're clearly seeking to help enable one of America's most trusted allies. But Dak's point, I think, is really well taken here. That what is the U.S. seeking? What is Australia seeking? Speed. This is not a deterrence equation that might materialize around 2027 or 2035 or 2040. We have a deterrence problem staring us in the face, and the answer to that is numbers, is production, and is speed of delivery of those. Let me kind of throw this around a little bit too, because we've been talking about the environment, the ecosystem. This is a term that you encounter a lot, that what the folks who have been putting their shoulders to the wheel inside of government, there's been a ton of work done here, is trying to get towards, inch towards, crawl towards, I don't know what verb we want to use, regulatory harmonization. That is creating an enabling environment so that we can do things together more easily. But I find that there's sometimes something of a circular argument here. That you'll hear on the one hand, what are you trying to produce? We're trying to produce an enabling environment. Mm-hmm. And then people will say, but we actually need to produce something to show that we can do this. And the response will be, well, no, we're actually trying to get all the regulatory harmonization first. And we don't need politicians telling us that we just need a project to hang things onto. Mm-hmm. Personally, from my perspective, I see these as not nearly so mutually exclusive. They enable each other. Mm-hmm. Aussies like to talk about pipe cleaners, which Lee will tell us a little more about in a second. But I'd like to hear how you all think about this tension. But really, if we're going to talk about enabling and prioritizing certain projects, none of you have to pick winners. Lee, you're not allowed to pick a winner that it rhymes with missiles, considering you're on board of one. But are there particular projects that are ripe to produce things to get us moving on the defense deterrence front that will help the system create that ecosystem? Let me start with Lee, actually, for your thoughts on this one.
Well, first of all, just that comment on speed, and we're talking about complex problems, complex acquisition systems. But the first responsibility of leaders, apart from looking after their people, is actually to reduce barriers, to look down and say, where are the barriers, and move them out of the way. We've actually got license at the moment to actually, from the regulatory changes, from the direction from our leadership, the money that's coming into defence systems, to actually get on and find out where there are barriers and blockages and move through. And it's not set and forget. And I think in the Australian system, and I've been there, there's been a lot of work on defence reviews, strategies, investment programs and prioritisation to put discipline in the process. And then there's take a breather, pipe cleaner to prove that some maybe weapons system programs or other programs can actually be done in Australia very effectively and very efficiently. But we can't be set and forget. We actually have to acknowledge now that there are disruptive forces upon us, notwithstanding the rhetoric that's coming out of the United States, but there are industrialist companies which are coming in, which will be able to do things 10 times faster, 10 times better, and 10 times cheaper. And we actually have to embrace this now, in concurrently with the other things that we actually need right now as well. So I think it's important that we have the right mindset. And I just want to repeat that. It's actually the responsibility of leadership now to look down and say, where are the barriers, and remove them. If it's legal, if it's regulatory correct, and it's what we want, demand, get cracking and move as fast as you can.
Yeah, I don't know if either of you guys want to take a bite at the apple about particular projects that might look riper, or particular industries or areas that might be some of those pipe cleaners that we're beginning to see.
So my take on pipe cleaners is that there's always barrier in the system, and both sides will get together and say, we're going to do this project, and it's going to clean out all the goo, and everything's going to work perfect in the future. And that doesn't work. As Lee said, you can't just set and forget. You have to continually monitor the defense ecosystem, the partnership, and continue to look for new barriers and try to overcome and remove them. The barriers are at the strategic level. They can relate to regulation. They can relate to funding. Who's going to pay for this? There's a challenge that our requirements processes are not aligned. So how do you decide how to size the facilities? And then there's just sort of smaller cultural challenges as well. We heard from Australia, we heard about Australian industry on both sides that U.S. small businesses are more willing to brag about what they're doing. They're more willing to engage legal counsel if they hit barriers. And Australian firms just don't have that background of complaining as much as U.S. companies do. So I think there is a role for the Australian government to really think about its own industrial base and how to identify and address not just the process barriers, but the cultural barriers to get companies interested and focused on and educated about the opportunities to do business in the partnership with U.S. firms.
Dak?
I don't necessarily want to pick programs, but I'll pick probably the biggest elephant in the room, and that's Virginia-class submarines. that is probably the biggest pipe cleaner possible. And I think it's important to note that the Virginia-class submarine is arguably the highest technology available in the United States arsenal. And because of the deep integration between the U.S. and Australia, we decided that we were going to sell them to Australia. The technological capabilities that those submarines provide, the extreme amounts of high technology that's in the submarine, the nuclear propulsion associated with it, that requires a deep commitment to accelerate as quickly as possible. Remember, that submarine was never intended for export, ever. Yeah. The only buyer was going to be the United States Navy. And yet a decision was made to move forward with that. We also can't let it go by and not acknowledge this tremendous investment that the Australian people have given to the United States to accelerate those Virginia-class submarines through the U.S. submarine industrial base. But I have seen, again, one of the most high technology things that the U.S. has in its arsenal, and that program is proceeding at pace to be able to meet the requirements that have been laid out in the AUKUS partnership. I know this is not an AUKUS conversation, but it is a tremendous capability that is moving as fast as it can relative to the high technology that it's going to deliver.
Yeah, but this is really interesting because it's moving as fast as it can, but it's not moving fast enough. And one of the reasons it's not moving fast enough is because the U.S. SIB, the submarine industrial base, doesn't have enough secondary, tertiary suppliers for the valves, for the pipes, for all the intricate parts that go into that really complex set of technology. So one of the things that we're talking about here is, yes, the U.S. makes these. Yes, potentially, probably, hopefully, the U.S. is going to sell 2, 3, or 5 of these to Australia, but only if it produces more itself. And so one of the things actually that's quite interesting in this is whether or not those smaller firms in Australia can begin feeding into the supply chain, even for the U.S. Virginia-class submarines, which is actually something that's being looked at right now about certifying those firms, because not everything that goes into the Virginia-class needs to be produced in America itself. Cynthia, you were going to say
Well,
something.
some of those firms did raise that. So they did see AUKUS, both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, as potential opportunities to get more engaged in the U.S. industrial base. But I will highlight that even going at full speed, it will be a number of years before Australia does get the nuclear-powered submarine.
Yep.
So given that, along with the importance of missiles and munitions, another potential area for cooperation is on uncrewed surface and subsurface vehicles. These can be built less expensively, they can be built at scale. You could have a factory in Australia, and they do deliver a capability.
In fact, you already do have factories in Australia.
Well,
that
there you
produce
go.
these.
So again, that kind of cooperation on newer systems is very promising. As Dak mentioned, both in Australia and in the United States, we're seeing an unprecedented amount of private capital and interest in supporting both nations' national defense from the venture community. So I think the time is really, the present moment is one where we can make those investments in big capabilities like submarines, in really critical investments in things like munitions, and also in emerging technologies like USVs and UUVs.
Yeah, I'd like to pause
Charlie,
this just
can
for
I-
a second
can I just
here.
follow on from-
No, you can't. Sorry. Oh, hold on, Lee.
Oh, sorry.
I cut off Dak. I'm going to cut you off too. Just 2 seconds. Hold your thought, because I want to make sure that we get to a couple of questions from people who have started to send them in here too. Then you can say whatever it is that you wanted to. Look, first question in, if you don't mind, is from Mark Smith with BAE Systems, also former chairman of AIA. So someone you might know, Dak. Right. And he's coming right at you, Dak. Mark writes that you had mentioned, Dak, the regulatory and qualification process as a barrier. Some countries have a reciprocal agreement that allows audits performed by the home country defense auditors to be accepted by the U.S. Department of Defense. Australia does not have such a reciprocal agreement with the U.S. Do you know if there's any desire to pursue such an agreement?
So I don't know anything immediately if there's an intent to pursue, but frankly, that sounds like a great takeaway to go to the next thing, the next barrier that we want to get after. And that goes back to my comment about what are the tactical things that prevent us from meeting the strategic objectives, security clearances, facility clearances, audits, right? That's a really good example. So let's take that. Let's go back. Mark, thank you. I'll take that. I'll put that on my list to go back and have a discussion with and see what we can make some progress.
Yeah. Another one that I want to throw to Lee, because I very rudely cut him off, but I think this was teeing up the conversation that we were going to have. Will Metz, who's a non-resident fellow here at CSIS with the DIG program, writes that, can you speak to how AUKUS implementation could have specific benefits for the U.S.-Australia defense industrial integration? How is it that we harness and use AUKUS for the broader project that we're talking about here with this particular report?
Thanks, Charlie. Well, look, I think there's multiple benefits from AUKUS, but we've got to be careful. Not everything is AUKUS. Of course, there's the bilateral relationship, and as I said, Australia's of course got relationships, with European companies and countries, etc. as well. So that has to be acknowledged. But AUKUS, of course, is the technological transfer means that not only will the end users in Australia, the US and UK, get the systems and the hardware and that they need now and into the future, but the potential for, in particular, Australian companies, and you are right, Cynthia, we self-deter. We actually don't talk ourselves down, but we don't actually appreciate what we have in Australia. We actually need to lift our game and punch into our weight rather than punch above our weight, and realise that AUKUS, across those 8 areas that we have in AUKUS Pillar 2, we have significant capability, significant pedigree, not only in current defence industry companies, but also emerging and adjacent industries as well. So the opportunities are significant. And then just going back to what Dak spoke about in terms of AUKUS Pillar 1 and the Virginia class, are Australian companies ready, and are they able? Absolutely. To take the burden from the US in terms of actually what's needed to fast track not just the Virginia class, but other parts of the US shipbuilding needs here into the future. So AUKUS gives us license to move not just more quickly, but to benefit Australia, defence industry and our end users in a far more timely way.
Let me throw one out to one of our online friends who chooses not to be identified. This happens often when you're talking with companies who have other companies in the room. So we'll just say an acquisition specialist asked this question. And it's one that we actually have been talking about a little bit, about how U.S.-Australian defense industrial integration, how it actually affects smaller defense contractors in both countries. That is, are there opportunities for them to benefit from large-scale contracts with partner governments? I believe that was the one, Cynthia, you highlighted in red as hardest. Or will they face challenges working across national lines? Maybe we can make that a little bit more specific of a question to say, Dak, you talked about some of the legal hurdles, some of the facility hurdles. But again, if you are one of those companies that you found on your own, Cynthia, that looked at this and said, interesting, too hard. What are the opportunities? How do you begin to approach this? Yes, maybe being a little scratchier. Yes, being a little bit more vocal. But where do they start here?
I don't think this is necessarily a good news story. The companies that are most successful at selling to the United States are ones that set up U.S. subsidiaries. So basically, we're telling our partner, one of our closest partners, that your industry, you have to go native in order to sell to us. It just makes it easier through the entire acquisition system for this to happen. And companies recognize this, and that's what they do. What this does do is create a larger barrier for smaller companies, which may have innovation that we can't access. But this is not unprecedented. The U.S. prime contractors have subsidiaries in Australia. There's Boeing Australia, Lockheed Australia. Yeah. So it is typical for companies to set up local subsidiaries in host nations. We just have to think about the barrier it represents for smaller, innovative firms.
The biggest challenge that we see is for some of these companies that are Boeing Australia or Northrop Grumman Australia versus their parent company here in the United States, and this is why we focus in on the export control side.
Yeah.
Sometimes those two organizations can't talk to each other because of the export control restrictions.
That is true.
And we have endeavored to try and break those barriers down as much as possible. That's also true when a small or medium-sized company, whether it's a U.S. company or whether it's an Australian company, when they're trying to sell into one of those other firms, they run into the same problems. But I will say this, more so, I've been in the business quite a long time. I have never seen small and medium-sized companies, of which are many members of AIA, come to me specifically and say, tell me more about, and the first word out of their mouth is Australia. There's no other country in the world they come to me and ask me about. But right now it's tell me about Australia, what are the opportunities, how can I get engaged, what contacts do I need in Australia, whether it's in Canberra or Adelaide or Sydney. They're coming to me asking for those contacts because they recognize the opportunity both from a resiliency perspective, but also an opportunity for them to grow their business. And for a defense industrial base that's struggled for the last number of years, that's what we want them to do.
Got it. Before I swing to Lee, let me just kind of conscious of the time here, but I am listening to the testimony of U.S. officials coming in. I did listen to the State of the Union last night over here, which deregulation was promised in every which way you can look, but that applies here as well. And so I guess I would ask if, as we begin to exit here, Lee, you're the Aussie on the panel, but I am curious, what is the thing that you would have us take away from this? Yes, we can be kind of grandiose and strategic, but is there like one or two things specifically that you'd put at the top of the queue for the new officials who are coming in, or for the same folks who have been handling this for quite a while in Australia? What do they need to do to break down these barriers? I'm going to come to each of you on this one before we exit, too.
Well, as a general statement is that, the demand for Australia and our commitment to the alliance, not only from a military and a political perspective, but from an industrial perspective, is really heightened. And we are ready and we will contribute, and we've demonstrated that. I think really we got what we needed yesterday. Actually, we had a potential Undersecretary mention Australia by name and mention how important Australia is and how important it is for Australia to increase its defence spending, because its importance in America's thinking going forward strategically, but also in terms of our defence industrial base. So a continuation of that. Australia, as Dak and Cynthia have said, we don't need to remind Washington of the importance of Australia, we think, to the US because of our geostrategic position right now. But we do need to remind the US that we're not a small country. We're not going to self-deter. We actually have a vibrant defence industrial base. We're prepared to pay for the things that we need to, but we want to do more in Australia for the alliance. It's good for the alliance and it's good for Australia.
Yeah. Okay. So first thing we heard is a demand signal that has been received. So the first marching order is Australia is going to be spending more. The question, of course, and you don't have to answer this one, Lee, there's an election coming up in Australia quite soon, but Australia is going to spend more, but who's the capital coming from? Is it coming from the government? Is it coming from venture capital? Who's actually going to provide the impetus and the pump here in the first place? But Dak, over to you about maybe the checklist to come across some of these officials, what they should be going after first.
So this is pretty easy because it's the same checklist that we have at AIA for the administration coming in. The first thing is just to use the Australian term, I want to pipe clean the technology, security, and foreign disclosure process of the United States. That will assist Australia. It will assist every other country that does work with the U.S. Defense Industrial Base. The technology, security, and foreign disclosure process has never been right-sized. It's an opportunity for us to take a look at it to ensure that we're protecting what we need, but allowing our partners and allies the access to U.S. technology in a way that just maximizes the deterrence effect around the world. A couple of other things. We really need to look at third-party transfer opportunities for those countries that we cooperate with. I think for countries like Australia, who are our closest partners, that is top of mind for us. And then finally, I mentioned it at the front end, the missile technology control regime, and looking at the MTCR-related regulations and how we read the MTCR versus how other countries read the MTCR, and ensuring that we are not self-limiting ourselves in in our reading of the MTCR that precludes cooperation with partners and allies. So those are three really key areas we're going to focus on going forward.
Terrific, thanks. Cindy, you get the last word here.
I will highlight that last thing just because missiles are so important. So yes. So I have recommendations for both the Australian and the U.S. government. And the Australian ones really come directly out of the research, which is they have to see that solving these challenges will take both a top-down approach where they're working these specific regulatory challenges, but also investing in a bottom-up approach, training businesses on how to do business with the U.S., trying to get them to, understand the U.S. acquisition system, getting them to realize that things take time and they need to hang in there, just continuing with that education. So really at the top level, making sure there's money, at the bottom level, making sure that industry stays interested. Yeah. And to me, this is really something that requires management or change management. So seeing this as something like they have an idea of where they want to get to, so manage this as a change effort to really ensure there's a vision and continued focus on the approach to move it forward. For the U.S. side, that's a little bit more trickier just because we're in the middle of such a transition. I would just hope that the new administration does not view any of the last 4 years' policies as anything to do with politics. These are national strategic issues. AUKUS is a strategic issue. Support for GWIO is a strategic issue. Policies like Piper and RSF and other efforts that tie us more closely to our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific regions are absolutely necessary for the way forward. They do not need to be reinvented. We should build on the foundation that we already have.
Terrific. Look, I'd just like to take a moment to thank both Lee and Dak for joining us, for lending their expertise here. Lee's just disappeared off the screen, so he's out. But also especially to thank, and he's back, zooming around. Don't get carried away with the F-35 over there. But really to thank Cynthia and her team for collaborating with us, but for really doing so much of the research to produce this. It is timely. It doesn't necessarily make the most of headlines, but if we're talking about deterrence, if we're talking about strategic equilibrium, there is nothing more important than producing more mass and having more capabilities directed by capital. And breaking down the barriers to ensure that we push forward is exactly what we need to get there. So I thank all of you for joining us here today. The report is just out, Enhancing Defense Industrial Cooperation between Australia and the United States. Thanks everyone so much for joining us this evening or this morning in Australia.